We are very fortunate this evening to have Mr. Stewart Udall with us. He was, for many years, congressman from his native state of Arizona, and later Secretary of the Interior from 1961 until the present administration took over. His topic concerning the environment is a most urgent one, and it is perhaps singularly appropriate that he should arrive on this day to give his talk when the smog here is probably unusually bad. Now, from the vantage point of the Department of the Interior, he was able to get a broad view of the entire environmental problem, which was not possible to obtain for most of us who are confined to little niches and corners here and there. I would like to mention that since he has left the Department of the Interior and returned to, quote, private life, unquote, he has spent much time giving lectures, writing books, and developing a consultant bureau called Overview, which deals with the problems of the environment and how to make man fit into his environment in a better way. It is also fortunate that Mr. Udall is willing to answer a few questions at the end of his formal remarks, and I am sure that you have come loaded with many devastating questions. Thank you. Mr. Udall.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to see that this campus has apparently a lively interest in the subject of the environment and a very splendid quota of effete intellectual snobs as well. By the way, whatever happened to Agnew? You know, maybe he did lose that election after all. Thoreau, who's almost my favorite writer and thinker of all, he's becoming more valid every day, as they would say, made that wonderful statement that most men lead lives of quiet desperation. And I've been thinking of my life the last few days. You know, some of us lead very eventful and bizarre lives. I will remember this is the week in my life when I celebrated two things. Thursday will be the 10th anniversary of my becoming a member of President Kennedy's cabinet, and it was also will be the week in which in an exploit of absent-mindedness, I got busted. So we'll hope that somehow I'm able to rescue my reputation in the days ahead. In any event, I'm delighted to be with you this evening. I've chosen as my topic limits, the environmental imperative of the 1970s. And what I'm trying to say or implying in that is that I believe that we have reached a point in our history when from now on restraint in what we do with our machines and our technology, the way that we live, In other words, that maybe Thoreau was right and that we must return to simplicity and restraint. But of course this runs counter, it runs across the grain of all of American thinking. The American outlook, the thing that has dominated the American mind, as we know, has been conquest, the conquest of new frontiers. We've even talked with our great scientific and technical skill in recent years about annihilating space and annihilating time. We've had some silly talk as part of the space program about colonizing the planets. And always the idea that has dominated us has been what one might call growth mania, that all growth is good, that a bigger machine is better than a smaller one, that faster is always better, and on and on and on. The environmental crisis suggests that whether these ideas were valid or these concepts for a period of time, that they're increasingly not only invalid but dangerous for our national life, and that limits and restraint must be the keynote of man's activities both here and in other parts of the world. I think sometimes that maybe we have seen and are seeing now, if we look at it in proper perspective, a preview of things to come, perhaps the most important international negotiations that will go on this decade are going on with the Soviet Union now, and it's called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Until a very few years ago, no American politician would be caught dead saying anything other than the fact that we had to have twice as many bombers or missiles or whatever it was, and to have an overwhelmingly predominant military strength vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. We're now willing to accept the idea of limits. That's what those talks are all about. In fact, we've reached the point where it's too dangerous, too costly, too ridiculous, really, to proceed on a spiral in that direction. So even in this area, so important to the world, we've come to the idea where limits is the dominating idea. And it seemed to me that we may have seen another preview that suggests limits in the greatest disaster, the one involving natural disaster, so-called, this century in East Pakistan a few weeks ago, when in the short space of a few hours, something like 500 million, we'll never really know how many, 500 million people were drowned. And it seemed almost, because this is the most densely populated part of the world, that both the East Pakistanis and the rest of the people of the world shrugged as though it didn't matter much. And for my part, I don't regard that as a natural catastrophe, as most people would say. I think it was an environmental disaster, because it's an area with too many people, too overpopulated with people living where they should not have lived. They had to, it's true. But this is, as I read it, an environmental disaster, and it's one that suggests that we do have indeed a very crucial world population problem, as well as having one here. In fact, I would even bring the point more closer to home. The alternating flash fires and floods that you have in Southern California, they're always billed in the press as natural disasters. They are not. What happens is very predictable. What happens is a direct result of nature retaliating for violating nature's laws, for doing things, for building, failing to leave open space, the whole bit. And these too are simply environmental, man-caused disasters. So let's be honest about it and face up to that. Nature's trying to say something to us. It's trying to say that there is a carrying capacity, or should be, of some kind in Southern California, just as there should be a carrying capacity in East Pakistan or in other parts of the world. And of course, all of this is saying that the Committee for a Lesser Los Angeles may have something that we should listen to. I was thinking, earlier this week, it was going through my mind that maybe we're beginning to make a little headway. because it occurred to me that Ralph Nader, for example, is having a great deal more to say and far more influence about what the shape of the American future looks like than the president of General Motors or any other large American corporation. That's a rather interesting change. And if we could have a proliferation of Ralph Naders, just back from Hawaii, they have one out there. We probably need several here. You're in such trouble. But maybe there is some hope. And I was thinking too, and I understand you have an active chapter here, that probably in terms of the future of this country, the predicament we're in as I see it, that probably the Zero Population Growth Organization, 18 months old, is more important than the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's rather radical, but I think it's so. So we, and I'm talking about the USA now, I think we have to think in terms of limits on population, on our demands on resources, even limits on mechanization. You know, the vote against the SST, and I'll come back to that, was a vote against more speed, at least of a certain kind. It means limits, recognizing that there are limits on the pollution that a natural system can absorb, whether it's an atmosphere or a hydrosphere or whatever it is. It's a curious thing, you know. And man's bumping up against these boundaries and these limits that I'm talking about. The economic miracle of Japan that the world has watched with its mouth open the last few years is beginning to unravel. There is the almost literal danger that, at least in their large areas, that they may choke themselves on their own production and their own affluence, because there are cities that have worse air than Los Angeles. And this, again, I think is the kind of warning, it's the kind of message where nature is trying to say something and saying that we had better begin to exercise restraint and to work with rather than against the basic laws of nature. So what the environment movement means then, and it's evolving very rapidly, and it's very dynamic in my opinion, is that we are groping towards a whole series of changes that could transform our society, transform American life. I really believe that. Some silly people last year at the time of the Earth Day said, well, we were talking about environment so much we'd talk it to death, it'd be a fad. And I poo-pooed that at the time, and I noticed good old Time magazine, Willie Brandt was Man of the Year, and the environment was Issue of the Year. It's here to stay. It'll be here for a generation. In fact, it'll get worse unless we make some very basic changes in our industrial system, in our priorities, and on down the line. As a matter of fact, I would suggest to you that what has been happening politically is that the environment movement today represents a convergence of several forces. And some of these people may not regard themselves as allies. They should, because they're working for the same cause, life and the quality of life. But we see a convergence of organizations and groups and ideas that are all interested primarily in life and the quality of life. The conservation movement is, of course, at the center of it. The consumer movement, Ralph Nader and I talk to the same audiences, the same doctrine, basically. After all, you're consumers not simply of goods that you buy in stores or things that you eat. You consume the air you breathe every minute. You consume the environment of the city or the neighborhood that you live in, and on and on and on. So we're all consumers. The other elements of this coalition concerned about the quality of life, of course, are the design professions that we listen to too little, the scientists that are increasingly organizing and speaking up in some parts of this country, the family planning, abortion reform people, women's liberation. As far as I'm concerned, its main thrust is part of this movement concerning the quality of life. and I may return to that, so if there are any male chauvinist pigs here, you better brace yourselves. But I'm talking grandiosely about history and turning the course of history, and it sounds like a big order, and it is indeed. Because I don't think we can solve the environmental crisis. I don't think we can solve the social crisis that grips us in this country, the disease of racism that we have to get rid of, the major domestic national problem we have, and even these two link together if you look at them as I do. But it means we have to change our value system, we have to change direction, we have to change our institutions in this country. And in an exciting way, it means that the next few years, the next 20 or 30 years probably, potentially are the most creative, exciting period in the history of this country, by far. Because we will have to have so much change at such a rapid rate that this is going to mean the kind of ferment that is going now. I hope it's still a rising tide in this country. Will continue. We go forward and back, there's an ebb and flow, but I think there is a tremendous dissatisfaction and frustration that is very wholesome in this country. And the fact that most of it comes from the younger people is hopeful, because they will win or lose this battle. They're the ones that really inherit the earth, and they're the ones whose values are most important, not those of my generation. So if I may give you a quick broad brush environmentalist view of recent history, and why we not necessarily went down the wrong road, but we went down it with too much gusto and with ignoring things. When I look back at my own generation and its goals 25 years ago, at the end of World War II, we wanted to do some rather simple things. It seems rather simple-minded when you look back on it, but it's very logical. We were looking back over our shoulders at the worst depression this country had ever had and the most destructive war that the people on this planet had ever had. And we wanted rather simple things. We wanted an economic system that would work. We wanted a feeling of economic security. We wanted jobs. We wanted to own an automobile, everybody did. We wanted to own our own home on our own piece of ground and the race to the suburbs and all that. We wanted and hoped that we could have a world in which we didn't blow it up with nuclear weapons. We haven't avoided wars, including some recent and very miserable ones. But nevertheless, in a way, we almost succeeded too well in this. As a matter of fact, the dark side that we call the dark side of this kind of progress that we call the environmental crisis is the result of charging ahead too fast in a way that put quantitative things ahead of the quality of life. And above all in this period, we took, I think, what one might call a rather simple, straight engineering approach to progress. The great feats of our time have been the Manhattan Project, building the atomic bomb, the space program more recently, the highway program, great engineering program, our pyramids in this country. If the bombs dropped tomorrow night, are the interstate highway system, these enormous pyramids of concrete that are such a feature of the landscape here, of course. We put an enormous and very heavy emphasis, as I've said, on quantitative economic growth. We've almost worshipped at the shrine of GNP and per capita income and so on, so much so that the younger generation is now reacting against it, against the materialism of being over-concerned with security and consumer goods and things of that kind. We also, in this period, with an emphasis on jobs, on security, on people being the organization man, of people getting into the system and doing their little job. We destroyed a lot of creativity, I suspect, in this drive for quantitative economic performance. There's also a period of a triumph of specialization. We're a nation of brilliant specialists, and we've literally taken the environment apart as specialists, doing single-minded things, whether it was building electric power systems or dams or transportation systems or whatever it is. We've been doing these things in a very single-minded, intense way. And now we have to think as ecologists, as generalists. That's what our universities have got to turn out. Enough generalists, enough people who can help us put the pieces together. These are going to be the valuable people in the future. And we can't simply have, as we did in the 1960s, this glib confidence that if we just sit back, science would come riding to the rescue. I used to say that 10 years ago, and that's what most of my advisors told me, and it didn't come riding to the rescue. We continued to go on down the drain because we needed new priorities, new emphasis, and above all, the ecological ideas that are at the heart of the environmental crisis. So this is a quick look at how we got where we are today. And certainly, if you ask me in the simplest terms to describe the environmental crisis, it's the fact that at the very time our standard of living has been going on a rising curve these last 25 years, a fantastic performance any way you measure it, that our living standards, the livability of our cities have been going down like this. The most extraordinary thing about this period is that the cities, the large and middle-sized cities of this country, have almost literally been getting less livable before our eyes, have been going down the drain during the period of the greatest mechanical and industrial and economic period of triumph in our country's history. So these environmental, social, urban problems now must come to the forefront. This is what we're trying to say. And the environmental movement, this coalition that I'm talking about, and I hope it can coalesce with the blacks and the poor as well, because it is their cause that must be up front, means that we are trying to form new ideas, new concepts, new programs that could literally be a hinge on which history could slowly pivot in this country. And we would redefine progress, how belated that task is. And we would take a whole different idea towards growth. We might even have the slow growth or quality growth or even anti-growth movement take hold in a region like this in order to save what you've got, literally. This is what we're headed for. No question at all about it. There was a brilliant report turned in by a state environmental commission, mostly professors at the University of Colorado, 2 weeks ago, and they said literally that Colorado, that magnificent state, was going to go down the drain unless three fundamental concepts that had governed its growth and the growth of the nation really were altered. These were the idea that population growth is a good thing, the idea that all economic growth is beneficial, and the idea that the automobile can serve as a rational transportation system for a region. Said we had to unhook ourselves from these very basic and deeply embedded ideas. And so this is the essence of what the environmental revolution, if you want to call it that, to use dramatic language, is all about. And the people I think sometimes that understand at least are some of the economists. The economists have been one of the most brilliantly successful groups, and I hate to start criticizing them because they could make such a great contribution if they would shift around a bit and start showing us how to build a quality of life economy in this country. But I think sometimes the silliest people there are, the people that are doing the most disservice to our country, are those who are simply projecting the past into the future and that are telling us that we must assume that population growth will double, that GNP will go on an upward curve, and that we must simply have more of everything, growth mania, in other words. Herman Kahn, the futurist, published the most absurd book, in my view, of last year, in which he told the Japanese, it was about the Japanese economy. At the very moment they were choking on their own wastes, mind you, that they were going to surge before the end of the century was out, and have the highest standard of living and the dominant economy in the entire world. At the very moment when the whole thing is becoming unhinged, at least as I read that country. And so we need to have questions asked about these goals that are held up before us every day, about what this country is going to be, simply because that's the direction we're headed in. I saw the figure the other day. I think Bob McNamara, the secretary or the president of the World Bank, used it, that at the end of this century, the United States was going to have an average per capita income of $10,000 per person. What would we do with such wealth? And if achieving that goal, if that goal were achieved at the expense of the vast, dark-skinned people of the unpopulated or the underdeveloped nations of the world, if we are going to have a higher and higher standard of living, and part of the reason because of our drain on their resources, this planet only has so many resources, that it condemns them to having a much lower standard of living. Can we have a stable world if we're going to pursue these goals? Well, these are some of the kinds of questions that environmentalists believe that we have to ask, and ask now. You know, any time I find a banker who says something that I'm trying to say better than I can say it, I quote him. And this one happens to be not only a California banker, I guess is the biggest banker in the country, because the environment movement, among other things, is a value revolution. I think the best thinking that's coming from the campuses in this country is a questioning of values. I think it's high time we question them. But listen to this language as an antidote to the thinking and the whole emphasis of American life that we measured everything economically, by our income, by the goods that we own, by GNP, and so on and so on. Louis Lundborg of the Bank of America said this in a very eloquent speech 3 or 4 months ago. There's a new value system emerging in this country. For generations we've been mouthing the cliche, you can't stand in the way of progress. Now there's a new generation that's saying, the hell you can't. That generation and an increasing number of its elders are saying, prove to us that it is really progress. In a sense, that is the essence of much that is stirring and boiling and seething. Thoughtful people in increasing numbers are asking about one thing after another. Is it really progress? Progress for the human condition. The human condition is not always an economic thing. That's the point that we're getting to. And so if we put the environment and cities and human problems up front, as they should be, and if we put down such things as new military systems and further expensive adventures in space, you know, we're going to get increasingly bored with each new load of moon rocks from the moon, particularly if we realize what we could do with that money to improve the lives of human beings. You know, rocks against people, I'm for people, I must say. But to do what environmentalists are now suggesting means not only that people must continue, as they're doing all over this country, to fight progress. They ask you where the battle line is in the environment today, people are fighting progress. You know, they're fighting dams and electric power plants they think are in the wrong place. They're fighting chemical plants that want to edge into the seacoast. They're fighting freeways. The very things that to my generation have been the symbols of progress, you know. Great, here comes a road. Somebody's going to build a dam. People are fighting these things. And some of them are, this is an obstructive thing to a degree. But essentially, as I read it, what these people are saying is, look, let's slow down. Something's missing. They're trying to superimpose a new set of values, humanistic, holistic values, over the whole enterprise, trying to get a new way of making decisions in which we crank in some of these quality of life considerations and life considerations. And this does mean indeed redirecting technology and new priorities and changes in our institutions. Well, up to this point, and I hate to talk so long, but this is a very big subject when you have the idea, the big tent idea that I have of environment. But I think I ought to get down to some specifics so that if my generalities go over anybody's head, that I can rattle off a few things just to bring it right down to earth. And to throw one at you, I think, and I think most environmentalists that I respect think it's more important to put the bicycle back in the city than to build the SST. You know, something just simple like that. And it's much more important, far more important, to begin controlling pollution and to protect the ecosystem of this earth. We've got to be earthlings now. I want to get our eyes off the moon. It's a lot more important to do that than to go to Mars or bring back these new loads of moon rocks. You know, this is the kind of priorities we're talking about. It means that rather than build these enormous, new, huge engineering projects that we're capable of building, even good old Bucky Fuller's domes built over cities, you know, walling nature out, giving up on the big fight, that it's more important to learn to recycle our wastes and reuse our so-called wastes, which are really valuable, irreplaceable raw materials, than to simply be building larger and larger engineering works. As a matter of fact, I have to spend a minute on the SST, and this, I believe, was our biggest victory last year. You know, in a period of 10 months, if you can change 12 or 15 senators' minds, that's something. And this was done, and it was done in an interesting way by people like you. You know, if you ask me the question, are we making a dent in the system? Are we making change? Well, I can't point out too many things that are enormously encouraging, but the SST, even though we appear to have lost it, it's won, I'll tell you. It's won for a number of reasons. But, you know, if you ask the supporters of the SST, people like the last two presidents and most businessmen, why we're building the SST, the answer comes back in economic terms and in terms of prestige. You know, if we're going to build faster and bigger aircraft, we will build them. This is an area that we lead in. Our prestige rides on this. Then they talk about economics and jobs and so on, and I'll dispose of that in a moment. But it's essentially this type of argument that we must lead in those areas of technology that we've traditionally led in. The fact of the matter is that the airline industry in this country is so sick that they would like to see the SST go away and disappear. And the fact of the matter is that the British and French are going to abandon theirs. In other words, it's economically an Edsel, so the smart thing to do is not build it. But the environmentalist approaches the SST in a completely different way. Just as when I read the figures the other day that last year the U.S. airlines had a load factor of under 50%. You know, half the seats were empty. As an environmentalist, I said, well, we wasted half the energy, number one. Number two, we had twice as much pollution as we should have had from aircraft. You know, that's the environmentalist approach to it. But the environmentalist looks at the SST and says, well, now, what does it do humanistically for people? And what does it do for or against the life support system that their lives and the lives of their children are going to depend on for a long time into the future? And the only answer you get from the supporters of the SST when you think of that is that, well, it's going to get people from here to there faster. And you say, who is it going to get there? The international jet set and the VIPs. I'm one of them. Very important people. It'll get us to London or wherever it is in half the time, so we can struggle longer on the ground to get into wherever we're going. And And yet, what is it going to do to people? This is the question the environmentalist asks. Because if we build it, it will fly overland across this country. And 20 or 30 million people will learn to live with a boom. And they will have their lives invaded with a kind of environmental violence we haven't asked people to live with. And beyond that, there is the likelihood, we don't know, at least it's possible, that in the stratosphere this fleet at full operation would disrupt the atmosphere and the climate of the entire northern hemisphere. So these are the kind of environmental arguments, you see, that won against the old bigger and better machine philosophy that has been governing in this country. Beyond that, it seems to me, in terms of the specific things that we must do, and here is where our architects and the design professions generally, if we would give the best of them the support that they need. Most of their brilliant ideas are on shelves in planning books. That instead of building the kind of mega structures that we see going up around here and in other places, that we would begin to concentrate on the human scale amenities that are so important. We're back to fountains and bicycles and green space and all the rest of those things. And so the environmentalist would argue too that achieving in the next 15 or 20 years, if we can do it, something close to zero population growth is far more vital than barreling on ahead to a 3 trillion GNP economy. That's a pretty radical statement, but I think most environmentalists believe it. And this means then, in trying to sum it up, that if I'm even half right in what I've said to you tonight, that we are going to see, or should see, more social change, more change in institutions, more industrial change, more of a redirecting of the whole life of our country than we have ever seen previously. As a matter of fact, even if we did only one thing, which was to move to the two-child family and move in the direction of zero population growth, this would mean enormous social and cultural change. It would mean that certainly many of the ideas of women's liberation are highly relevant because women must live much fuller lives and must make a much larger contribution, which I happen to think our country desperately needs at this time. And it also would mean in terms of the family, in terms of lifestyles, enormous changes. So that some of these things are sure to happen. We will achieve the larger things if the environmental tide is coming in the way I believe it is, and is still a rising tide. And if people begin to see that the only way that we can preserve the things that we have, the only way that we can save hope for the future is to have policies that are environmentally sound and to begin to turn our attention and our priorities and our goals towards the problems of people, towards the problems of man and his environment, towards the rebuilding, reshaping, reviving of our cities and their life, and all of these things that are so intimately related to not simply the physical environment, but the man and his environment concept. So that environmentalists then, if they are anything, if there's any central concepts that dominate their thinking, they say that we've got to be holistic. We have got to think not just of the specialized parts. We've got to try and understand all these interrelationships. And this probably throws a bigger challenge at education generally, and particularly at higher education. It means the old in-the-groove specialized education isn't enough, because it means that we will not have the capacity as a society to relate the parts to the whole, and to have a unified view of man and his society, his future, his overall activities. It means, too, that we must be far more humanistic in the sense that I've been discussing this evening. I'm sure you know what I mean. To our whole approach to the enterprise in this country. It means less emphasis on mechanism and the kind of quantitative economics that's dominated our lives, on certain types of consumerism, and more attention to the simple, Thoreau-like humanistic values. It means, above all, that we must respect the ecosystem of our planet and the environmental values that are all around us. So the real issue then is whether the future is simply going to happen, as we are told every day by all the projections based on the past, or whether we have the capacity to control our future and to change our lives and to change our national goals, our national purpose, our institutions. It's a very large order, I know that. And there's no way of knowing whether we're going to achieve it, but I believe we must, or at least begin to achieve significant parts of it. So I want to end on the note that I began by saying that I believe the environmental crisis, seen at least in the context that I'm trying to see it, means that this is potentially a most challenging time to people, and particularly to young people. The generation coming on the scene will win or lose this, as I said earlier, because you will not change values overnight. This will not be done easily or readily. I don't want to kid anyone about that. But it does mean over a period of a generation, perhaps, slowly turning our direction, changing direction, achieving different goals. It means, I believe, a very exciting, provocative period in our national history. One of the great experiences of my life was in his latter years. In fact, I was with him 10 years ago now, getting acquainted with Robert Frost, the old poet who spoke at President Kennedy's inauguration on that cold day 10 years ago on Thursday. And he and I did a lot of things together. And in the last year of his life, we went to Russia and we both saw Khrushchev. And we were coming back on the plane, and he said the thing to me that he said at other times when he'd had a very interesting time. He said, "Great times to be alive, aren't they?" He was 88, and he died 6 months later. And I look at today and say, yes, indeed. Thank you. I'll take questions about anything except cigars. Go ahead.
Just wait a second. He has a question.
Do you think that it's possible to win the ecological battle with the capitalist system? And also, how do you feel that racism relates to the environment?
Yeah, you hear the question? Do I have to repeat it? Should I repeat it? Well, he asked the question, can we win the ecological battle in a capitalist system? Well, I think it's certainly implicit in what I've said that we have to make some very basic changes. I noticed that even Henry Ford of that slow-footed industry gave a speech a couple of months ago in which he said that industry faced more change in a shorter period of time, the same sort of thing I'm saying, than at any period in American history. And he wasn't sure the changes were going to be good for industry, but he thought the people were demanding them. I would say that certainly the old letter rip-off raider American capitalistic system that has dominated the last 100 years in this country, that you couldn't very well hope to win an environmental battle. But I believe the kind of laws, Senator Muskie's air pollution bill that just passed, we're finally really getting down to tough laws with goals, performance standards, and everything else, that it is possible that we can make changes in our industrial system that could make it compatible with the environment. But there are a lot of changes. I would suggest also in the same breath, and I've been there, that some of the other economic systems like the Soviet Union are in worse trouble or about the same trouble we're in. Okay?
Hold it. Oh, okay. Well, I'm a human, I'm an environmentalist, but I'm not heard by the elite power corporate structure that runs this country. And I want to know how I can affect them, how they can concretely hear me and do something about the Alaskan pipeline, about the oil spillage in the San Francisco Bay, about all the birds and all the people that are dying.
Well, the interesting thing, people like me used to say to people like you, write your congressman. And sometimes that's still, like on a thing like the SST, isn't a bad idea. But the thing that has begun to emerge in this country, I hope it again is just beginning, are these kind of environmental action groups that are locally based, that it may be coalitions of students, of scientists, of conservationists, and others. This holds real promise. They're winning local battles all around this country. I think one of the best things that could happen is that if we could have a Ralph Nader type group in every state capital and every large city in the country, and we could have allied environmental action groups that were getting things done. I happen to be on the national board of the Environmental Defense Fund, which started out fighting the battle against DDT. In the last year, we won 3 or 4 really startling law cases, setting a whole new basis for what people can and can't do, or even what governments can't do. And so you don't just passively write your congressman. Find something to do right in your local community. If there isn't a group, organize it. I think the fantastic growth of ZPG, to me, is a very encouraging thing. I think the seeds of most of the ideas I'm talking about are involved in this young new organization of young people. Doesn't do me any good to belong to it. Although I do, I'm typical of my generation, the father of 6.
I've heard it said that minority groups feel that their only hope for progress are more jobs and incorporation into the economic system to raise their income. Now, if you begin to curb the gross national product and economic expansion, what hope lies for these people?
This is a very telling question, and it's one that I wish I were an economist. I think the economists, friends of mine like Walter Heller and others, admittedly oversimplify the whole thing when they say the ordinary thing economists say to environmentalists is, look, you guys are crazy. You want to throttle down the economy. The only way you're going to solve environmental and social problems is for the economy to grow. And in part, they're right. Although, you see, in the first place, that argument begs the question about new priorities, for example, and the fact that we could have what I would call a quality of life oriented economy, that we don't simply have to have this whole business where even sales of heroin are part of our gross national product, and all these other antisocial things. And I am not of that school of thought myself that is for zero gross national product. I know that because of the dynamism in it, that our economy is going to grow. I think that probably a certain amount of growth maybe is a good thing, but it's the redirecting of it. It's the spending of our money for things that will enhance life, which will help us to do the things we should do with our cities, with our environment, and so on. These, I think, are the important things. But the economic thing, it's amazing how little has been written on this subject. I think the field's wide open. If I were a young economist, I think there's a whole field for new theories and new analyses of economics that could lead us out of this wilderness that we're in. I wish I were a young economist right now. Yeah, of course. I've got to get out of the clutches of the law, though. Although I, as you can tell, I probably, even when I was in government, was less establishment. You know, so many of the things I was doing, although I had my friendly ties with the oil company because they were in my department, nevertheless, so many of the conservation things that I was involved in government were essentially trying to get the established industries and attitudes changed. But it is nice to be freer and not have to think of protecting silly things.
Could you briefly summarize the remarks you made at the AAAS conference in Chicago about the role of the scientific method? Some of us here who are in science have been tantalized by the brief excerpts we've been able to get of that. I'd like to hear from more.
He asks about this speech that I made to the AAAS meeting on science. Gee, that's a whole big subject, and let me try to summarize it this way. And I gave this speech with a great deal of trepidation. I'm not a scientist, except I've lived with them so much the last 10 years that I've learned to think along with them and converse with them and have enormous respect for most of them. But the scientists that are that I think we need more scientists like Barry Commoner and Paul Ehrlich and Kenneth Watt, and you have some whose names don't come to me right here in this area. Scientists who are trying to think of the total environment as a system. Scientists who are willing to get out of their specialty and stick their necks out a bit. And I was very dismayed, I have been for a long time, the way the older members of the scientific establishment, with the old attitudes and ideas, you know, well, look, Buster, stay in your little groove there, don't get out of your field, you know. And I know that science itself, as a discipline, means that everyone has to be a specialist. He has to be trained to understand a certain field. And there is a discipline involved in the scientific method. I know that. But at the same time, we have been intimidating scientists to not try to relate their field to the larger picture. Paul Ehrlich is a young biologist, studied butterflies. In fact, his critics say, why doesn't he go back to his butterflies? But that's part of it. It's also the fact that the scientific establishment in this country is very tightly run, is very cowed in a way. I'd like to see its politics studied. And I'm talking about the very prestigious National Academy of Science, the way that grants are passed out. Scientists aren't outspoken. They're pretty intimidated as a group because they don't want to, they're afraid that they'll lose a research grant, or that their colleagues or the people who control the strings on programs won't like them speaking out too much. And And this is what I tried to say, and I'm trying to get a foundation to put up a little money and get a group of outstanding young scientists to take a look at the scientific establishment in this country. I think it needs renovating, and I think scientists should make a much larger contribution. I think they can make a tremendous contribution in this field if we'll give them a little more freedom, let them speak out, and let them tell us about the big picture.
What is your reaction to the firing of Walter Hickel and the administration that fired him?
Oh, I think Hickel surprised all of us. The thing that happened to him, in case you didn't read between the lines, is that he's very ambitious, and he was running for president. He really was. But he's a good politician. He got with it. I think in his period he was doing a good job. He was right on most of the things that he did. He was outspoken and independent, and that's what I think Interior Secretaries ought to be. It takes about 2 years. The reason Secretaries of the Interior, like most cabinet secretaries, are zeros in history. You don't remember any of them. The average tenure, I found out when I went in there 10 years ago, the average tenure of a Secretary of Interior was something like 27 months. Well, it takes about that long to get acquainted with a job. That's, at least I found, that when I felt I was getting on top of my job, it was about the 3rd year. And some said I never did. And Hickel, I think, was coming on strong, and personally, I think President Nixon should have swallowed whatever the personality thing was and kept him on. I think it was unfortunate.
Can you think of any way to persuade the developing countries that pollution is a global problem and not just a game of the affluent?
Well, I think you're right, and we're going to find, and that's one of the contributions, I think, that environmentalists, ecologists have made in the last year. You know, the speeches most of us gave on campuses last year, people like Barry Commoner and the rest of us, were essentially trying to sell the idea of ecology. You know, I don't even talk about it anymore. Everybody understands it. There is a small planet and it's a spaceship and so on, and that everything's interrelated, and that we damn well better start trying to understand it. But when you face the fact that a small minority of the people, mostly living in the northern hemisphere, are the ones who are tearing the ecosystem apart, who are destroying the life support system of the planet, this certainly puts an enormous moral responsibility on these countries. Some have been figuring out, or have been making little calculations, and every one I see is a bit different, you know, that each new child born in this country, because of our enormous demand for resources and our enormous production of energy, will pollute more than 80 children newly born in India, let us say. And this is probably an underestimate, in my opinion. So on the one hand, this is what frightens me about the world picture. We are demanding and sucking into our economy the raw materials and the basic resources of undeveloped countries. And at the same time, we are spewing out pollution that is destroying their planet and their life support system. And this is one reason why I think it would be utterly disastrous for us as a nation to think that we can go charging on down the road that we've been on the last 25 years to a 3 or 4 trillion GNP economy, to an enormously high and wasteful and gluttonous rate of individual consumption. and widening the gap between the have and the have-not nations of the world, I think is a way to blow up this planet, literally.
Mr. Secretary, as former Secretary of Interior, you are the custodian of our natural resources and public domain, and supervise the development of the natural resources on the public domain. Now that you're in public life, don't you feel that a great deal of our problems are created by the static that is accumulated in the communication between the industries involved, the public on whose domain this development is being made, and the government in Washington?
Well, yes, I don't think there's any question about it. I'm writing a nationally syndicated column, which the Los Angeles Times syndicate has just taken over, so I hope maybe you can read me some of these sometime soon. And I was just doing one on the U.S. Forest Service, for example, which used to be, in the old days, out front in the conservation field. I mean, it was the drum leader. And they've fallen on evil days. They're being attacked. You know, there are mineral kings all over this country. There are environmental groups that are attacking the Forest Service. And this is an example of where the old stand-pat ways of administration, the old approach of being too cozy with local commodity or user groups, just won't do in a time when environmental thinking and environmental planning are important. So that this is one thing the environmental movement can do, and that's what is happening with this new Environmental Quality Council that's also endowed at this moment, although I heard from one of the reporters this evening that President Nixon did what I've been urging his people to have him do for months, you know, as an act of moving against the congressional pork barrel, that he shut down this cross-Florida barge canal and said, we're not going to build it. You know, Congress authorized it, appropriated money, it's a third build. It's an economic disaster, an ecological disaster, and economically it's stupid, and so we say, all right, we're going to quit. We spent $40 million, but we're not going to build it. Doesn't make sense in 1971, and this is the sort of thing we're going to have to do.
Since we can't write to the congressman and get much done, what do you think about the economic reprisal of not buying Saran wrap? Has this had any particular value when Dow is so flaunting the whole Lake Erie situation with Canada as a scapegoat and so forth?
No, I don't.
Is there anything we can do individually in not buying, or should we write to Dow instead of to the congressman, or who could you follow through on an economic basis?
Well, I feel very strongly that the environmental action groups and the students and others who are focusing attention on individual lifestyles, that this is very crucial. You know, it's so darn easy to sit back, look at the big picture, and think that laws in Washington, you know, and turning getting a Dow Chemical or somebody to stop dumping mercury, that this is the solution to our problems. I really could give a whole lecture, and I think it's maybe in the long run may be just as important as these laws and political and industrial changes of the whole changing lifestyle thing, of us demanding less, of us being willing to cooperate in recycling recycling waste and materials, of us boycotting certain products, of using natural things. You know, the curious way, and I think Thoreau would get a big kick out of it, you know, the wisest people in this country are headed back to doing what the Indians were doing when the white man arrived, you know, living simply, living close to the land, and this sort of thing. It's amazing how many people, and all of them aren't young people, are beginning to see this.
Mr. Udall, what is your opinion of or solution to the Mineral King project?
I think it ought to be not built. Yeah. He's asking what can you do on the, he considers Mineral King a very crucial issue, and what can you do next spring when they start to build it. Of course, I guess the Sierra Club's going up to Supreme Court, aren't they? I hope so. I don't know. It does seem to me that if the lawsuit doesn't work, that maybe an all-out effort ought to be made with the Environmental Quality Council of trying to get the president to do what he's apparently just done on this cross-Florida barge canal, which has been an outrageous thing that has been identified for years, and to really, you know, the more we can get presidents involved with the idea that they are responsible for something like this. And it's not just a bureaucrat in the Forest Service or the chief forester or somebody, that some of these decisions have got to be made at the very highest level. I'm all for this. The cutest little byplay, although President Nixon has taken the environment on as a cause, and he gave 30-odd speeches last fall in that campaign in 22 states, never mentioned the word environment. And he came to Florida, though, and in one of his appearances, there was some people who were against the cross-Florida barge canal who had a big banner, and it said, "Stop the canal." And some reporters heard this conversation between Nixon and Governor Kirk, and Nixon said to the governor, he said, "Have you got a canal problem down here?" And Kirk said in a very loud voice, "No, you have." And he was right. It's a federal project. And President Nixon now has surprised everybody by stopping it. But I mean, I don't think if the Supreme Court fails to take the lawsuit, that ought to be the end of it, because I think there's much stronger sentiment in the country than there was when the lawsuit began. In fact, the lawsuit's bought time, if nothing else.
Would you say something on the freeze that you put on the last?
Guys who stand to lose nothing but our forests.
Well, there may be a better way to win it than blowing up a tractor. I don't know, but I think the fight ought to be made. I think we ought to fight this thing all the way. And I never felt I got quite full enough credit. I stopped the damn thing dead in its tracks for a year and a half myself, about 4 or 5 years ago, you know. Well, let's head it off before we get to that.
Mr. Udall, I was privileged to speak to you last summer in your office at Overview, and I was speaking to you about the Bureau of Reclamation. And you talked generally about how the Bureau of Reclamation had been taken over by pork barrel legislation, but that you had been pretty strong about it. And when I asked specific questions about what you had done, you referred me to your solicitors, Mr. Barry and Mr. Weinberg. It turns out that was in June, and over the summer, it's become apparent that not only did you do things like signing contracts with PG&E for the sale of hydroelectric power from the excess power from your reclamation projects. Not only was the contract bad in terms of public interest, and you said that at that time it was bad but the best you could get, but that the Solicitor's Office of the Department of Interior has characterized it as possibly violating the antitrust laws. Let's see, things like why did you not enforce the anti-speculation laws on the reclamation projects, laws which both Mr. Weinberg and Mr. Barry concede should have been enforced. Mr. Weinberg claimed that the law should have been enforced, but it hadn't been enforced for so long that it wasn't right to enforce it anymore. Although you had still maintained, the Congressman, that the law was in effect. Why did you go so far with the $200 million of unearned increment in the Westlands project to prepare a 1,000-page legal brief for the Treasury Department requesting that companies like the Southern Pacific get a special tax break in '67? Why, you talk about...
Give me a chance here.
Okay, things like, you talked about quality of life and the moonshot and the SST. The Federal Reclamation Program will involve $15 billion, okay? And when the Bureau of the Budget asked you in '66 to conduct a study of the acreage limitation law to see whether it was feasible, instead of actually doing the study and finding, as you probably would have, that with the way you were enforcing the law, there was no reason, there was no problem because you weren't enforcing the residency law and there was no acreage limitation, that, and in fact, if you had done a study of the economies of scale, you wouldn't have found a problem, but you didn't do that, and so now the Murphy Bill is coming up, which will, under the cover of farm efficiency, is going to give companies like the Southern Pacific Company billions of dollars in unearned increments that could have gone to the federal government. Now, are you running for president also? No. Why should we believe that you're being honest?
Excuse me, sir. May
Well,
the audience be reminded that they are asking questions from our guests. You are not holding a dialogue nor talking to them. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure I'm not going to tell you that I think, in terms of the way I think tonight and the way I'm talking tonight, that everything I did in terms of Bureau of Reclamation decisions was right, just as I feel, and I've said so publicly many times, that the decision I made at Santa Barbara was one of the worst things that I did. But I think you're being rather unfair. Some of the things you're describing there, I know very little about, and these were done by people in the department. And you also obviously are not giving me credit for what I think were some of the things that I did. No Interior Secretary dared, until I did 6 years ago, and it's in court now finally. The worst thing in the whole reclamation history was the fact that the whole Imperial Valley, which is a feudal dukedom over there right today, in the hands of a few farmers, was never brought under the Act. I put it under, it's in court, and you know, Well, you know, if you want to argue with if the California Water Project's got a lot of things wrong with it, and I think it has some, you better blame Governor Brown and his people that put it together as much as you blame my people. But you're assuming an involvement on my part on a lot of detail of the kind of decisions that I didn't make. So
We have another question from Mr. Secretary.
Thank you. Mr. Udall?
Well,
I'd like to
obviously I'm not having much trouble persuading you. I was very good on that one. Sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to hear something about the freeze that you put on the Alaskan native land claims and what effect it's had.
Well, the natives of Alaska, who are 25% of the population of that state, are the last group of Indians in this country who never had their land claims settled. They never were given land, haven't been to this day. And yet when Congress passed the Alaska Statehood Bill 12 years ago, we gave the state the right to select a third of the land. So when the natives alerted me to the fact about 4 years ago now that if we didn't stop the state from selecting these federal lands, that they would take most of the lands that the natives living in villages mostly in various parts of the state wanted, I put a freeze on and said we wouldn't let the state select any more land. In fact, the only land the state did select is this North Slope oil field that is going to make the state enormously wealthy. And that was the thing Hickel said he was going to unfreeze my freeze. And Congress insisted he didn't. It's still in force. And the most important matter of Indian justice before Congress this year is the Alaska natives getting a generous settlement of land and money. And that's something everybody ought to support. I'm pretty good on some things anyway.
Mr. Udall, I'd like to go back to was one of the first questions that was raised in the audience concerning the SST. First of all, one has an uneasy feeling that it is not a dead issue and that it's a cancer that will reappear in the next legislative session of Congress. But if the decision in the future is to kill the SST development in this country, it was based upon a quantitative analysis and power politics of a sort that has been an example of past analyses. Do you really see any indication on a nationwide basis with our particular economic system that environmental issues are decided on anything other than quantitative economic analyses?
Well, the SST, I believe, when you look at the argument of the last year, and it was fascinating. Somebody could write a book on what's happened in the last 12 months on the SST and the way Congress's thinking was changed, the way the nation's thinking was turned around. And I think it probably was a combination of arguments that changed congressional opinion on this. I think part of it was related to this new feeling that national priorities are out of whack, you know, and that why the hell are we spending all that money on that kind of a project when there's so many other areas of research and development that are more important. And so that the environmental arguments were more than a make-weight. I think they probably were the main argument, but the feeling also, I think, began to grow that this whole project was a white elephant, that it was something that shouldn't have been started in the beginning. And I think, if you ask me, I believe the qualitative arguments, however, weighed more than the quantitative. But it isn't a matter, let's be honest with ourselves too, it isn't a matter of dismantling the Boeing Aircraft Company or Lockheed or the rest of these people. We've got to turn them into doing the kind of technological things that will benefit the environment. Most people 10 years from now that move in this urban corridor from San Diego to San Francisco on this coast ought not to go in the air. You know, we're saturating our airspace. We're running into saturation points everywhere. They ought not to get in their car. The cheapest, most efficient method, the one that would use the least energy and the one that would involve the least pollution probably, would be to have a tracked air cushion train. It's not a train really, it's a new kind of high-speed ground vehicle that will move at a rate of 150 to 200 miles an hour. And I think in a few years they'll have them even higher. And there's a California company that's ready to go with these. We could build them right now. It's the one that they have a little experimental line here they're fiddling around with. This ought to be a whole big new industry. And it could be as important as the aerospace industry was at a certain point. So, you know, we're redirecting industry. We're not just going to shut down the industries that have these kind of technical skills. Let's take one or two more and then we'll quit.
Mr. Udall, we live in an unfortunate area. As you know, we have an airshed that's intolerable. We're paved well beyond the capacity for pavement. We have very little free land in Los Angeles. I frankly do not see any road to take to ease the burden on the people who live here today. The question of simply leaving Los Angeles is one that I think many people face. Outside of the possibility of leaving, which is a difficulty for many people in this economy, what hope do you see for making a city like Los Angeles not even livable, but just improved in the future?
Well, I'll tell you, you've asked a very big question, but as an environmentalist overall, I think this region is very close to its carrying capacity myself, and I think that you ought to, at the very least, have some kind of a moratorium on certain types of growth. Maybe you should begin to think this way. It's curious, Hawaii. You know what, the Hawaiians in some ways, with their, they don't have a dominant race or culture out there. It's one of the great things. They're very open to new ideas too. They are probably going to pass shortly, and this is very widely discussed out there, how do they stabilize population in their state? Because they've got a good thing out there and they want to keep it. And of course Oahu, the one island, is in deep trouble. The other islands aren't yet, but there's a great deal of talk that I find enormously encouraging about how do they slow down in-migration from the other states, how do they lower population. They passed a very liberal abortion law and so on. And I think this sort of thinking's got to come to Southern California because as I read it, as I read you as an environment, your region, this is where you're going.
Yeah, I have a question, Mr. Udall. Yeah, I have a question with two parts. First, concerning your political future, I get the impression that you are finished with elective politics. And if this is true, I assume it's because you feel that you can make more of an effect outside of the political spectrum. I'd like you to comment on that, on to what your future is. And secondly, I know many social scientists and political scientists have felt that a great deal of the alienation among the youth, and at times I feel it's wearing off, and at times I see it even building up more in the teenagers, is due to the fact that there are very few politicians who young people can communicate with. And if men such as yourself, who do have the ability to communicate with young people, do not take some active role in elective politics, how can you actually ask us, who have very little chance of making near the contribution you have made, and I realize you spent 14 years, in politics, but if people like yourself don't stay in politics, then what chance can we have to let our voices be felt?
Well, I feel that I'm in politics. Certainly, as scientists discuss politics, I'm in up to the neck. But I do think that, and I find it rather encouraging that so many of the younger congressmen and senators are beginning to speak up on issues like the environment. I intend to be very much involved in politics in this next presidential campaign. I don't know where or how, because I want to stay in. But I don't think a person has to run for office. In fact, you can be freer. I'm enjoying the freedom that I have, without having to think whether something's going to be brought up against you. I have enough to worry about lately on that. I think a certain amount of outspokenness is needed. But one thing the politicians are going to find, maybe I'm wrong on this, I hope not, You know, in this next presidential election, because the 18-year-old vote, instead of there being 4 years of young adults, there are going to be 7 years of them. They could swing this election if they wanted to. And I think the crucial thing is whether they think the system will change, will move over. And if I were young, and if I were frustrated, and if I hated a lot of things about the system, I'd say, well, let's give it one big try. You know, maybe we can swing it this time and have an influence on it, because I think this next election could be very critical.
I had a couple of quickies here. They're
I'm
really
getting
quick.
tired,
Okay.
so don't denounce me, please.
Okay. No. I was wondering, do you foresee in the next 10, 20, or 30 years any massive social pressure for a two-child family, and do you foresee any legislative backup to this social pressure? And the other one is, was anything known about the mercury pollution problem several years ago, and what is being done about it now?
No, I think the mercury thing really came from nowhere and slapped us down. I was asking myself, because I ran the water pollution program the last 3 years, and nothing was ever brought to me about it. I think most of the scientists didn't realize that that mercury would methylate, or whatever it is they call it, become part of the food chain. There probably were some who knew about it, and then probably papers written, but it didn't really surface. And I think it shows, again, how little we know, because this is one of the worst forms of pollution. As far as the two-child family is concerned, this is one of the things I'm optimistic about. Most people don't agree with me. I think we're going to move in the next decade, or you young people are, I'm not going to have anything to do with it, to something approaching zero population growth. And I want to tell you why. Because all during the 1960s, people, neither people in or out of government, were talking the way I've been talking here tonight. We didn't have a zero population growth movement. But the birth rate in this country dropped nearly a third, from 24 per thousand to 17 between 1959 and 1970. It leveled off last year. This happened not because it started before the pill came along, and it didn't happen because the older generation was preaching it. It happened because of the new lifestyle and new attitudes of younger people. I think the pill undoubtedly played an important role in it. And now, I think there are several factors operating to move us in the direction of the small family. One thing, quite frankly, is that our cities are increasingly not good places to rear children. They're hostile to life, so many of the large cities. And if all you have to live in is a small apartment, you know, we've run out of space for certain kinds of urban sprawl. And so in that sense, our environmental failures are working in that direction. But the new things that the medical research people are coming up with look highly promising. If we leave the woman alone and start injecting things in the man, this whole thing might get very simple in a hurry. So the medical things, liberal abortion laws can play a temporary, very important role. As the medical things come on strong, liberal abortion laws will be less and less important. They're very important right now. I happen to think from figures I've seen that probably, you know, if the children born today were really, really wanted and planned for, we would have about 25% less. And this would take us down sharply in the direction of a leveling off of population. So I'm optimistic about this. Thank you very much.